On the 6th of July, 2012, just after 12:30 a.m., a CCTV camera in Star City, West Virginia, captured a moment that, at the time, appeared completely unremarkable. Skylar Neese quietly left her home during the night. She was 16 years old, a high school student living in a small town where daily life revolved around school, part-time work, and a close circle of friends. That night, she walked toward a car parked near her home. Inside were two people she trusted deeply, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. Both were also 16 years old and had been part of Skylar's life for years. To anyone watching the footage, nothing seemed unusual. No signs of distress, no raised voices, no visible tension. Just three teenagers in what looked like a quiet summer night. And then, after a short while, the car slowly pulled away from Skylar's home. At that moment, no one could have known what it meant. It would be the last time Skylar Neese was ever seen alive. By morning, the Neese household was still running like any other day, until her parents noticed something simple but unsettling. Skylar Neese wasn't in her bedroom. At first, there was no immediate reason to panic. She was active, busy with school, and a part-time job after classes. It was possible she had left early. Maybe she was with friends. Maybe there was an explanation they just didn't have yet. For a brief moment, they held on to those possibilities. But as they looked closer, small details began to stand out. Her phone charger was still plugged in and left behind. Her contact lenses were still in the room, things she would not normally forget if she planned to be away for any length of time. Then, there was one detail that felt harder to ignore. Her bedroom window was open. To someone else, it might have seemed insignificant. But to her family, it didn't feel right. As the hours passed without any word from Skylar, concern turned into fear. Her phone was off. Text messages from her mother went unanswered. It was as if she had simply disappeared. In the middle of that growing panic, the phone finally rang. On the other end was Sheila Eddy, one of Skylar Neese's closest friends. Sheila explained that she, Rachel, and Skylar had been together the night before. According to her account, they had simply driven around Star City. Nothing unusual, nothing to worry about. She said they had dropped Skylar off near her home. Skylar, she claimed, got out of the car and walked the rest of the way so the noise wouldn't wake her parents. For a moment, the explanation seemed to make sense. At least, it offered an answer. It gave the family a timeline for where Skylar was last seen. But that answer quickly led to a more troubling question. If Skylar really made it home that night, then where was she now? And that question is what ultimately led the Neese family to contact the police. At the early stage of the investigation, authorities did not immediately treat the case as something unusual. Teenagers leaving home voluntarily was not unheard of. Because of that, the disappearance of Skylar Neese was not initially classified as an emergency situation. But time has a way of changing the weight of a case. 24 hours passed, then 48. Still no word, no calls, no messages, no sign that Skylar could be located anywhere. As hope began to fade, the investigation slowly shifted direction. Police started gathering small fragments that might explain how a 16-year-old could simply vanish without a trace. One of the most important pieces came from CCTV footage around Skylar's home. Footage that had initially seemed routine, but upon closer review, something didn't quite align. Investigators returned to speak again with the last two people confirmed to have been with Skylar, Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. And this is where the story began to shift. Because the more questions they were asked, the harder it became to keep every answer consistent. Sheila Eddy once again described her version of that night. But there was a problem. The account she gave to police did not fully match what she had previously told Skylar's mother. The differences were small. But in a missing person investigation, small inconsistencies often mark the beginning of something much larger. Then investigators found another contradiction. The CCTV footage told a different story. Skylar Neese did not leave her home at the time Sheila had described. She was seen stepping outside around 12:30 a.m. A few minutes later, a light-colored sedan left the area. And after that, nothing. No further footage. No witnesses confirming where the car went. No trace that could be followed with certainty. It felt as though the moment that car disappeared into the night, Skylar Neese disappeared with it. And for the first time, investigators began to consider a far more disturbing possibility. This may not have been a case of a teenager simply running away. Something may have happened that night. The story had not collapsed yet. But for the first time, cracks were beginning to show. And as more time passed, the pressure around the case only intensified. Police continued to question everyone involved. The media kept the story alive, covering every new detail. And online, public attention started to narrow in on two names that kept resurfacing in the investigation: Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf. Two names that were slowly shifting in perception, from close friends to central figures in a growing investigation. But the scrutiny was not limited to the public. Behind the scenes, investigator Chris Berry began looking at the case from a different angle. The more he reviewed the statements from Sheila and Rachel, the stronger the feeling became. Something wasn't adding up, as if the answers had been rehearsed, repeated too many times. From experience, Chris knew one thing: when someone is holding on to a serious secret for too long, pressure eventually leaves marks. Sooner or later, those cracks begin to show. To find them, he started examining their social media activity. And what he saw raised questions. Sheila remained active, posting photos, interacting with friends, continuing life as if nothing had changed. Rachel Schoaf, on the other hand, was becoming increasingly withdrawn, less visible, harder to read. At the same time, public interest in Skylar Neese's disappearance kept growing. Sheila and Rachel were mentioned more and more in online discussions. Speculation spread, questions multiplied. And despite the rising pressure from every direction, both of them held onto the same version of events, at least for a while. Because the longer the case continued, the heavier the pressure became. And without anyone realizing it, that pressure was starting to turn personal. Slowly, it began to break one of them, something that could no longer stay hidden. From the outside, both girls continued trying to maintain what looked like normal lives. But pressure affects people differently. Some learn to hide it. Others slowly begin to break under it. By late 2012, nearly 6 months after the disappearance of Skylar Neese, something finally changed. On December 28, emergency services received a call from the home of Rachel Schoaf. Rachel's parents reported that their daughter was experiencing a severe emotional crisis and required a mental health evaluation.
Mon County 911, you have an emergency.
Yes. I have an issue with a 16-year-old daughter of mine. We can't control her anymore. Okay. No, this is over. This is over. My husband's trying to contain her. Please hurry.
To an outsider, it may have looked like a private struggle of a teenager under emotional strain. But to investigators, it carried a very different meaning. For months, they had believed that if anyone was going to break first, it would likely be Rachel. And now, that assumption was beginning to prove true. A few days later, Rachel Schoaf was once again seated in an interrogation room. For months, she had held onto the same version of events, that she and Sheila Eddy had dropped Skylar off near her home that night. But this time, something was different. For the first time, hesitation began to appear in her answers. And slowly, the story she had maintained for so long started to collapse. For the first time since the investigation began, Rachel admitted that Skylar Neese never made it home that night. And more than that, she acknowledged that she and Sheila were directly involved in their friend's death. When those words were finally spoken, the mystery surrounding Skylar's disappearance, held for nearly 6 months, began to open. Piece by piece, Rachel then revealed something even more disturbing. According to her account, what happened that night was not a spontaneous act driven by emotion. She admitted that she and Sheila Eddy had been planning what happened long before that night ever arrived. A trip that looked like an ordinary drive, laughter that sounded completely normal, a car disappearing into the darkness of the night. According to Rachel's confession, all of it was part of a plan that had already been set in motion. For investigators, this moment changed everything. They were no longer dealing with a missing person case. They were now confronting the reality that they had been investigating a homicide from the very beginning. And what made it even harder to process was something simple yet unsettling. The person who finally broke the silence was not a witness, not an outsider, but one of the two friends who had been in the car with Skylar Neese that night. After the confession, Rachel Schoaf and Sheila Eddy were both taken into custody. Now investigators knew who was involved. But one question remained, far more disturbing than the rest. What actually happened after that car left Skylar Neese's home on the night of the 7th of July, 2012? According to her confession, that night was never meant to be a normal drive. Before picking up Skylar Neese, both she and Sheila Eddy had already prepared certain items they intended to use once they reached their destination. They left Star City and drove toward a remote area in Pennsylvania, a place they were already familiar with, a location they had visited before to smoke marijuana and spend time together. But this time, the purpose was entirely different. According to Rachel's account, both of them had hidden knives under their clothing before meeting Skylar. When they arrived, the conversation initially felt normal. Nothing suggested that anything was about to happen. Then a simple excuse was given. A lighter, they said, had been left in the car. Skylar Neese turned and walked back to retrieve it. A small action, nothing unusual, especially among friends she trusted completely. According to Rachel, the moment Skylar turned her back, she and Sheila exchanged a silent count. 1, 2, 3. And on the final count, the plan they had been holding on to was carried out. Skylar did not see it coming. Only moments earlier, they had been talking as usual. No argument, no warning, no sign that anything was wrong. In the statements later given to investigators, it was said that the first attack did not immediately stop Skylar's movement. She tried to get away, she attempted to run from the area, but she did not succeed. Within minutes, what began as an ordinary meeting turned into a tragedy that could not be undone. In her final moments, Skylar Neese managed to say one question that would later become one of the most remembered parts of the case. Why? Not a scream, not a threat, just a question. A question that, to this day, remains in the minds of many who follow this case. After everything was over, both Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf attempted to hide what had taken place. According to the investigation, they brought a shovel to the area and tried to bury the body of Skylar Neese. But the ground was too hard and rocky to dig properly. In the end, they covered her using dry leaves, branches, and natural debris from the surrounding area before leaving the site. They cleaned themselves. They cleaned the vehicle. They changed their clothes. And they returned to their normal lives. Back to school, back to conversations with friends, back to routine, as if that night had never happened. Meanwhile, for months, Skylar's family continued living in uncertainty, still hoping that one day there would be news, still hoping their daughter might somehow be found alive. But that hope was slowly coming to an end. After Rachel's confession, investigators were finally led to the location where Skylar had been left. However, the search was not simple. Winter had changed the landscape of the area. Snow covered much of the ground that needed to be examined. Still, investigators eventually located the site they were looking for. And with that discovery, months of uncertainty that had haunted the Neese family finally came to an end. But at the same time, so did the hope that Skylar would ever come home. In March 2013, authorities officially confirmed that the remains recovered were those of Skylar Neese. The autopsy later revealed the level of violence that occurred that night. Skylar had suffered more than 50 stab wounds, a number that made the brutality of the attack unmistakable, and a detail that made one thing increasingly clear. This was not a brief moment of panic or a split-second loss of control. After the physical evidence and confessions were gathered, the case moved forward into the court system. Rachel Schoaf pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Sheila Eddy was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole in the future. Legally, the case had answers. The perpetrators were identified. Evidence had been recovered. Sentences had been delivered. But not every question ends in a courtroom, because even years later, one question continues to linger over the case. the motive. When investigators tried to understand why it happened, the answer they received was unsettling in its simplicity. Sheila Eddy and Rachel Schoaf ultimately said they no longer wanted to be friends with Skylar Neese. To many, that explanation was difficult to accept, because the deeper the case was examined, the clearer it became that the relationship between them was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. Some believed it was a mix of jealousy, friendship conflict, and emotional dynamics that had built up over months. But even today, no explanation fully answers why a friendship that lasted for years ended in such a way. And perhaps that is the most disturbing part of the case of Skylar Neese. Not how it was solved, not how the perpetrators were found, but the reality that sometimes a life can be taken for reasons that even after a trial still do not make sense. For the justice system, the case is closed. But for Skylar's family, time stopped the night a 16-year-old girl left home to meet two of her closest friends. And she never came back again.